f4, g6, e4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, g3, rook b8, bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, d6, knight f3, bishop g4, knight d5, knight f6, c3, b5, knight e3, b4, e5, d takes e5, knight takes g4, knight takes g4, knight d4, e takes d4, bishop takes c6, king f8, queen takes g4, d takes c3, bishop e3, c takes b2, rook d1, bishop d4, queen f3, b3, a3, bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, c4, king e2, queen b6, d takes c4, queen takes c6, queen e5, queen e6, queen takes e6, f takes e6, rook d7, king f7, rook takes a7, h5, rook b1, h4, g4, rook h d8, king e3, rook b c8, rook takes b2, rook takes c, rook takes b3, rook d d4, g5, rook e4, check, king d3, rook c d4, king c3, rook d8, rook c7, rook e2, rook b b7, rook e8, rook b2, rook e3, check, king d4, rook takes a3, rook c4, rook d8, check, king e4, rook d1, rook e2, rook d a1, rook d4, rook b1, rook c4, rook h3, king e5, rook a1, rook d4, rook h1, rook d d2, rook f1, rook c2, rook d3, rook c6, rook d5, check, king e4, rook a5, rook c4, rook f5, king e3, h3, rook e4, e5, rook takes e5, rook takes e5, f takes e5, king e6, king e4, rook g1, rook b2, rook g4, check, king f3, rook g2, rook b8, king f5, rook f8, check, king takes e5, rook f7, e6, rook f8, rook takes h2, king g3, rook g2, check, king takes h3, rook takes g5, rook f1, rook f5, rook b1, king f4, rook b4, check, king g5, rook g4, check, king f6, rook a4, e5, rook a6, check, king g5, rook e6, rook f3, check, king g2, rook e3, king f2, rook e4, rook e8, king f4, rook f8, check, king g4, rook g8, g5, rook e8, king h3, rook e7, rook f4, check, king e3, e4, rook h7, check, rook h4, rook g7, g4, king takes e4, d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, b6, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop b7, short castle, knight a5, b3, bishop e7, knight c3, short castle, bishop b2, c6, e4, d5, c takes d5, c takes d5, e5, knight d7, queen d3, rook c8, rook f d1, knight b8, h4, bishop a6, queen d2, knight a c6, rook d c1, queen d7, knight e1, rook f e8, bishop f3, knight b4, bishop d1, knight 4 c6, a3, knight a5, knight f3, rook f8, knight h2, rook c7, knight e2, rook f c8, knight f4, queen e8, rook takes c7, knight g4, queen b5, queen e3, rook c8, rook b1, h6, king g2, queen f1, check, king h2, bishop f8, a4, bishop b4, bishop c2, rook takes c2, rook takes f1, bishop takes bishop c1, knight a c6, knight h5, bishop f8, king g1, bishop e2, knight h f6, g takes knight takes f6, king h8, bishop d2, bishop a6, knight g4, knight d7, knight takes h6, bishop takes h6, queen takes h6, king g8, queen g5, check, king f8, queen h5, rook takes d2, queen h6, check, king e7, queen takes d2, knight f8, h5, king d8, h6, knight e7, king g2, bishop b7, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, c3, knight g e7, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight g6, d4, bishop e7, d5, knight a5, knight b d2, b5, bishop c2, c5, knight f1, d6, g3, bishop h3, knight e3, h6, b3, short castle, knight g1, bishop d7, h4, rook e8, knight f5, queen c8, king f1, knight b7, bishop takes G takes H6, queen G4, king H8, queen H5, king G8, knight takes H6, king G7, knight F5, check, bishop takes F5, E takes F5, rook H8, queen F3, knight F8, queen G4, check, king H6, knight H3, queen E8, knight G5, C4, B4, A5, A4, A takes B4, C takes B4, rook G8, queen F3, king G7, knight E4, knight D7, G4, knight D8, G5, F6, king E2, rook H8, A takes B5, rook takes A1, rook takes A, king F8, rook A7, rook takes H4, G6, C3, queen E3, knight F7, G takes F7, king takes F7, queen G3, rook H8, B6, king F8, B7, knight B8, D4, D5, C4, D takes C4, E4, B5, knight C3, A6, knight F3, E6, A4, C6, bishop E2, bishop B7, short castle, knight F6, E5, knight D5, bishop G5, queen B6, queen D2, H6, bishop H4, knight E7, G4, knight D5, rook F D1, knight D7, knight E4, C5, bishop G3, bishop E7, knight D6, check, bishop takes D6, E takes D6, short castle, knight E5, knight 5, F6, A5, queen A7, knight takes D7, knight takes D7, bishop H4, F6, queen E3, C takes D4, rook takes D4, E5, rook D2, queen takes E3, F takes E3, knight C5, rook D, D1, bishop E4, bishop E1, knight B3, rook A3, king F7, bishop B4, rook F D8, H4, king E6, king F2, rook A C8, rook E1, knight C5, rook D1, bishop C2, rook C1, knight D3, check, bishop takes D3, C takes D3, bishop D2, rook C4, king G3, rook takes D6, H5, rook D C6, king F3, king D5, rook E1, B4, rook A1, bishop B3, E4, check, king C5, rook G1, rook C2, bishop E3, check, king C4, rook A C1, rook D6, bishop D2, rook d4, king e3, bishop a4, rook a1, bishop c6, b3, check, king b5, rook a b1, rook a2, rook b d1, f4, g6, e4, c5, d3, d5, bishop e2, knight c6, knight f3, d takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes d1, bishop takes, bishop g7, c3, knight f6, bishop c2, short castle, rook d8, rook e1, b6, knight b d2, rook b8, g3, bishop a6, king g2, knight a5, h3, rook b c8, g4, h5, king g3, bishop d3, bishop takes d3, rook takes e5, knight d5, knight e4, h takes g4, h takes g4, knight c7, rook b1, knight c6, knight f2, rook d5, rook e4, f6, c4, rook d7, e6, rook d8, knight h4, rook d4, f5, g5, knight f3, rook d8, b3, knight b4, bishop d2, a5, rook e2, rook a8, a3, knight c6, bishop c3, knight e8, a4, king f8, rook d1, rook takes d, knight takes d1, knight d6, knight d2, knight b4, bishop takes b4, a takes b4, knight e3, rook b8, knight d5, knight c8, knight e4, knight a7, a5, b takes a5, knight takes c5, rook e8, knight d7, check, king g8, king f3, knight c6, king e4, rook a8, knight 5 b6, rook e8, rook a2, knight d8, c5, knight b7, king d5, king h8. e4, g6, d4, d6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop c4, knight f6, queen e2, c6, e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, knight d5, h3, short castle, bishop e6, rook e1, knight d7, bishop d2, queen c7, knight c3, knight 7 b6, bishop b3, a5, a4, knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop d5, e6, f5, knight g5, c5, bishop takes d5, knight takes d5, queen c4, queen c6, rook a b1, rook f e8, h4, knight b6, rook takes b, queen takes b6, h5, queen b2, h takes g6, h6, knight f7, queen takes c2, queen f4, rook e d8, knight takes h6, king f8, knight takes f5, queen takes d2, rook e3, queen d1, check, king h2, queen h5, check, rook h3, queen takes g6, knight takes g7, queen f6, knight f5, rook a6, e4, g6, d4, d6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop c4, knight f6, queen e2, c6, e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, knight d5, h3, short castle, short castle, bishop e6, bishop b3, knight d7, bishop d2, a5, knight c3, queen c7, rook f e1, knight takes c3, bishop takes c3, knight c5, bishop takes e6, knight takes e6, knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, c5, bishop c3, e6, rook a d1, rook f d8, rook takes d8, check, rook takes d, queen c4, b6, f4, rook d5, a4, queen d8, queen f1, h5, rook a1, queen d7, king h2, bishop h6, queen f3, c4, queen e3, queen c8, g4, h4, rook f1, queen c6, queen e2, queen takes a4, f5, bishop g7, f takes g6, f takes g6, king g1, queen d7, queen e4, b5, queen takes g6, b4, bishop e1, rook d1, g5, queen e7, king g2, rook d5, rook f4, rook takes e5, bishop takes a4, rook takes c4, queen d8, rook f4, queen d7, bishop f2, rook f5, rook takes f5, e takes f5, queen b6, queen d5, check, king g1, a3, queen b8, check, bishop f8, b takes a3, b takes a3, queen b6, a2, queen g6, king h8, queen h5, check, king g7, queen h6, check, king f7, queen f6, check, king e8, Queen A1, F4, Bishop D4, Queen takes G5, King F2, Queen G3, check, King F1, Queen takes H3, King F2, F4, G6, Knight F3, D5, C4, E6, G3, Bishop G7, Bishop G2, C5, short castle, Knight E7, D3, short castle, E4, Knight B, C6, Knight C3, D takes E4, D takes E4, Bishop takes C, B takes C3, Queen takes D, Rook takes D1, B6, Bishop E3, Bishop A6, Bishop F1, Rook A, D8, G4, Knight A5, Knight E5, King G7, Bishop F2, Bishop C8, Rook takes D, Rook takes D8, Bishop H4, King F8, A3, Rook D6, Knight F3, Knight B3, Rook E1, Knight D2, Rook E3, Knight takes F3, Rook takes F3, Rook D1, Bishop G5, Bishop B7, Rook D3, Rook takes D3, Bishop takes D3, Knight C6, King F2, Bishop A6, F5, King G7, F6, check, King F8, Bishop C2, Bishop takes C, Bishop A4, B5, Bishop D1, King E8, Bishop E3, Knight E5, King G3, Knight D7, E5, Knight takes E5, Bishop takes C, A6, Bishop C2, Knight D7, Bishop E7, Knight B6, Bishop C5, Knight D5, Bishop D4, King D7, Bishop E4, King D6, Bishop takes D5, King takes D5, Bishop B6, G5, Bishop E3, H6, H4, Bishop E2, H takes G5, H takes G5, Bishop takes G5, King C4, Bishop E3, King takes C3, G5, Bishop H5, Bishop A7, A5, Bishop B8, King B3, Bishop D6, B4, A takes B4, A takes B4, Bishop C5, King C3, Bishop D6, B3, Bishop E5, check, King C2, G6, Bishop takes G6, King F3, F4, G6, Knight F3, D5, G3, C6, Bishop G2, Queen B6, A4, A5, Knight C3, Bishop G7, E3, Knight F6, D3, short castle, Knight A6, h3, knight e8, king h2, knight d6, e4, d takes e4, d takes e4, bishop e6, queen e1, h5, knight h4, knight b4, bishop e3, c5, rook f2, knight c4, bishop c1, bishop d4, rook e2, rook f e8, f5, g takes f5, e takes f5, bishop d7, queen f1, bishop c6, knight e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, bishop takes b2, bishop takes b2, knight takes b2, f6, queen takes f6, rook f2, queen g7, knight f5, queen h8, c3, rook a d8, queen c1, king f8, queen takes b2, knight d3, bishop takes d3, rook takes d3, queen e2, c4, rook a f1, f6, knight d4, queen h6, queen e6, rook d2, queen takes c4, queen e3, knight e6, check, king g8, f4, g6, knight f3, d5, g3, c6, bishop g2, queen b6, a4, a5, knight c3, bishop g7, e3, knight f6, d3, short castle, short castle, knight b d7, d4, queen c7, b3, b6, rook e1, bishop a6, knight e5, e6, bishop a3, rook f d8, bishop f1, bishop takes f, rook takes f1, rook a c8, queen e2, h5, rook a d1, rook e8, queen a6, knight g4, queen d3, knight d f6, rook c1, rook e d8, rook f d1, knight h6, rook e1, knight f5, rook b1, c5, knight b5, queen b7, knight f3, knight e4, rook b c1, knight f d6, knight takes d6, rook takes d6, rook f1, rook d d8, queen e2, rook d7, rook f e1, rook d c7, c4, d takes c4, b takes c4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, rook d7, rook e d1, e5, f takes e5, bishop takes e5, queen g2, bishop g7, queen f3, rook c d8, bishop b2, rook d6, queen g2, queen e7, rook a1, knight c5, queen f3, queen e8, rook a3, knight takes a4, bishop a1, knight c5, queen f2, knight e4, queen f1, knight g5, king h1, rook c8, king g1, rook f6, queen g2, rook takes c4, rook a d3, rook d6, h3, b5, g4, h4, king f1, knight e4, queen f3, b4, king g1, a4, queen f4, f4, g6, knight f3, d5, g3, c6, bishop g2, queen b6, b3, knight f6, bishop b2, bishop g7, e3, short castle, knight b d7, queen c1, a5, bishop d4, queen d8, c4, b6, d3, bishop b7, queen b2, e6, rook e1, queen e7, knight b d2, c5, bishop c3, rook f d8, rook a d1, knight b8, knight e5, knight e8, knight d f3, f6, knight g4, knight a6, knight h4, queen f7, a3, knight b8, c takes d5, e takes d5, e4, d4, bishop d2, knight c6, rook b1, knight c7, queen c1, king h8, f5, g5, knight f3, h5, knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, e5, bishop takes e5, knight takes g5, queen f6, queen d1, king g7, queen takes h5, rook h8, queen g4, king f8, rook e2, rook e8, rook f1, knight b5, knight e6, check, king f7, bishop g5, rook e g8, bishop takes f6, rook takes g4, f4, g6, knight f3, d5, g3, c6, bishop g2, queen b6, b3, knight f6, bishop b2, bishop g7, e3, short castle, knight b d7, queen e2, a5, d3, a4, knight b d2, knight e8, bishop d4, bishop takes e takes d4, knight d6, bishop h3, rook e8, c4, queen c7, bishop g2, knight f5, b takes a4, knight f6, knight b3, rook takes a4, rook f c, d takes c4, d takes c4, h5, knight c5, rook a3, queen b2, Queen a5. Knight takes b7. Bishop takes b7. Queen takes knight g4. Queen b2. Rook d8. c5. Queen a4. Rook c3. Rook takes c3. Queen takes c3. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. Rook takes bishop f1. Rook e4. Rook b1. e5. Rook b2. Queen a7. F takes e5. Rook takes e5. a4. Rook takes c5. Queen d4. Knight e5. Rook f2. Queen e7. Queen e3. King g7. Bishop e2. Rook d5. Rook f4. f6. h4. Rook a5. g4. H takes g4. Rook takes g4. c5. Rook f4. Queen d6. Queen e4. f5. Queen b7. Check. King h6. Queen b2. Rook a7. Queen c1. King h7. Queen d1. Queen e7. Rook f2. Rook d7. Queen b3. Rook d4. h5. Queen g5. Check. King h1. Rook h4. Check. Rook h2. Rook takes h2. King takes queen d2. H takes g6. King g7. Queen b5. f4. King g1. Queen e1. Check. King g2. Queen g3. Check. King h1. f3. Queen b7. Check. King takes g6. Queen e4. Check. King f6. Bishop f1. f4. g6. Knight f3. d5. g3. c6. Bishop g2. Queen b6. b3. Knight f6. Bishop b2. Bishop g7. e3. Bishop g4. h3. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3. Short castle. g4. Knight b d7. d4. c5. Short castle. Rook f d8. c3. Queen e6. Queen e2. Knight e4. Queen g2. C takes d4. C takes d4. Rook a c8. Knight a3. Knight d f6. g5. Knight h5. Bishop g4. Queen a6. Bishop takes c. Rook takes c8. Rook f e1. Knight h g3. Rook a c1. Rook takes bishop takes c. Queen a5. Rook d1. h6. G takes h6. Bishop f6. Queen c2. Queen a6. Knight b1. Bishop h4. a4. Queen e6. Rook e1. Queen takes h3. Queen g2. Queen c8. Bishop b2. Knight f5. h7. Check. King h8. Rook e2. bishop f2, check, queen takes f2, knight takes f2, king takes f2, knight d6, king e1, queen h3, knight c3, knight f5, king d2, e4, c6, c4, d5, c takes d5, c takes d5, d4, g6, e5, a6, g3, f6, bishop g2, knight c6, knight c3, f takes e5, d takes e5, e6, knight f3, knight g e7, short castle, bishop g7, knight a4, b6, bishop f4, bishop d7, rook c1, h6, h4, short castle, queen d2, knight f5, rook f d1, rook f7, knight c3, rook c8, bishop h3, queen e7, knight e2, king h7, a3, b5, queen d3, king g8, king g2, queen e8, rook d2, knight c e7, rook takes c, queen takes c, rook c2, queen b7, knight e d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f5, bishop takes f5, g takes f5, queen d2, queen b8, bishop takes h6, queen takes e5, knight f3, queen e4, bishop takes g7, rook takes g7, rook c7, f4, queen c3, d4, queen c5, queen d5, queen takes d5, e takes d5, rook c5, f takes g3, f takes g3, rook e7, knight takes d4, rook e5, king f3, king f8, rook c7, bishop h3, knight e2, king e8, rook c2, bishop d7, knight f4, bishop f5, rook e2, bishop e4, check, king e3, king d7, king d4, rook f5, h5, king d6, h6, rook f8, rook h2, bishop b1, rook h1, bishop h7, rook h5, rook g8, rook takes d5, king e7, rook c5, king d7, rook c3, bishop b1, b4, rook e8, rook e3, rook g8, rook b3, bishop c2, rook c3, bishop b1, rook e3, king d6, rook e6, check, king d7, rook takes a6, rook takes g, king c5, rook c3, king takes b5, rook f3, rook f6, rook takes a3, knight g6, rook h3, h7, bishop takes g, rook takes g6, rook takes h7, e4, c6, c4, d5, c takes d5, c takes d5, d4, g6, e takes d5, knight f6, knight c3, knight takes d5, queen b3, knight b6, bishop e3, bishop g7, rook d1, short castle, bishop e2, bishop d7, knight f3, bishop c6, rook c1, knight d5, short castle, e6, bishop d2, knight e7, rook f d1, knight d7, knight b5, knight b6, bishop g5, knight b d5, queen a3, h6, bishop h4, knight f4, bishop f1, g5, bishop g3, a6, knight c3, bishop takes g takes f3, knight c6, bishop takes f4, g takes f4, d5, knight d4, d takes e6, queen g5, check, king h1, knight takes f3, knight e2, queen h5, h3, f takes e6, rook d7, knight g5, rook c, bishop e5, rook takes b7, queen g6, f3, queen b1, king g2, knight takes h3, queen a5, queen f5, king h1, rook a e8, bishop g2, knight g5, knight g1, rook c8, queen e1, bishop f6, queen d1, queen g6, knight e2, rook c2, rook d3, rook f c8, rook b d7, e5, rook d2, rook takes d2, rook takes d2, e4, knight takes f4, queen f5, rook c2, rook d8, rook d2, rook b8, knight h5, e takes f3, knight takes f6, queen takes f, queen c1, f takes g2, check, rook takes g, queen e6, queen f4, rook f8, rook takes g5, h takes g, queen takes g5, check, f4, g6, knight f3, d5, g3, c6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3, bishop g4, short castle, knight d7, d4, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, f5, e3, knight g f6, b3, rook c8, bishop b2, short castle, knight e2, knight e4, c4, b5, c takes d5, c takes d5, knight c1, queen b6, knight d3, b4, g4, e6, a3, b takes a3, bishop takes a3, rook f e8, bishop b4, knight c3, queen c2, knight b5, queen d2, knight takes d4, e takes d4, bishop takes d4, king g2, f takes g4, bishop takes g4, knight f6, bishop f3, knight e4, queen e2, bishop takes a1, rook takes a1, queen b7, queen b2, queen b6, rook a2, a6, bishop e1, queen e3, queen e2, queen takes e2, check, rook takes e2, knight c3, rook c2, knight b5, rook a2, knight d4, bishop d1, knight f5, king f2, rook c6, b4, rook f8, knight c5, knight d6, king g3, knight f5, check, king f3, rook b8, king e2, rook b6, king d3, rook c7, bishop c3, rook a7, rook a5, knight e7, bishop a4, knight c6, bishop takes c6, rook takes c6, bishop d4, rook f7, rook takes a6, rook takes a6, knight takes a6, rook b7, king c3, king f7, king b3, king e7, bishop e5, rook b6, knight c5, rook c6, king a4, rook c8, king b5, d4, king c4, d3, king takes d3, rook d8, check, king c4, f4, g6, knight f3, d5, g3, c6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3, bishop g4, short castle, knight d7, d4, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, f5, e3, h5, bishop d2, knight g f6, queen e1, e6, rook d1, h4, g takes h4, queen e7, a4, rook h6, a5, king f7, a6, b6, knight a2, rook c8, queen e2, rook takes h4, bishop e1, rook h3, c4, d takes c4, queen takes c4, knight d5, queen e2, knight 7 f6, bishop g3, knight h5, bishop takes h5, rook takes h5, knight c3, queen d7, rook d2, bishop f8, e4, knight f6, e5, knight e8, queen d3, knight c7, rook c1, bishop e7, rook g2, b5, bishop f2, knight takes a6, queen g3, rook h6, rook a1, knight b4, bishop e3, rook a8, knight e4, a5, knight g5, check, king g7, king h1, a4, bishop d2, knight c2, rook d1, a3, b takes a3, rook takes a3, bishop c3, knight b4, rook a1, rook takes a1, bishop takes a, knight d5, bishop b2, bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, b4, king g1, queen a7, queen g3, queen a2, h3, queen b1, check, king h2, queen e4, bishop c1, queen takes d4, rook a2, rook h5, rook a8, queen b6, queen g2, b3, rook a4, c5, queen f2, g5, f takes g5, f4, b6, e4, c5, knight c3, e6, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, bishop b7, knight h3, d6, short castle, h5, d3, h4, g4, queen d7, f5, e takes f5, g takes f5, long castle, knight g5, knight f6, b3, queen e8, a4, bishop e7, knight b5, king b8, bishop d2, rook g8, queen e1, g6, queen takes a6, knight c3, knight d4, rook a b1, g takes f5, a5, knight h7, queen takes h7, bishop takes g5, bishop takes g5, rook takes g5, queen h4, queen g8, rook f2, queen g7, king h1, knight e6, knight d5, rook h8, queen takes h8, queen takes 8, rook b f1, e4, c5, knight e2, knight c6, knight b c3, knight d4, knight takes d4, c takes d4, knight e2, d5, e5, queen b6, c3, d takes c3, d takes c3, e6, knight d4, bishop d7, bishop d3, bishop c5, bishop e3, queen takes b2, short castle, b6, queen g4, king f8, c4, knight e7, c takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop c4, h5, queen e4, rook d8, bishop takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop takes d4, e6, F takes E6, Queen D6, check, King F7, Bishop takes D4, Queen B5, Queen G3, Rook H G8, Rook F E1, Bishop C6, Rook E5, Queen C4, Queen F4, check, King E8, Rook A E1, Rook D6, Rook 5 E3, Queen D5, Rook F3, Rook D7, H4, Queen takes A2, Rook G3, Queen C4, Rook G6, Rook E7, Rook C1, Queen D5, Bishop B2, Queen E4, Queen G3, King F7, Rook G5, E5, Bishop takes E5, G6, Bishop B2, Bishop D7, Queen D6, Bishop F5, Queen F6, check, King E8, Rook G3, Rook F8, Queen C3, Queen B7, Rook E3, Rook takes E3, Queen takes E3, check, Queen E7, Queen C3, Bishop E6, Queen G3, B5, Queen takes G6, Rook F7, Rook E1, King D7, Rook D1, check, King C7, Bishop E5, check, King B6, Rook D6, Queen takes D6, Bishop takes D6, Bishop C4, D4, Knight F6, C4, G6, G3, C5, Knight F3, Queen A5, check, Knight C3, Bishop G7, Bishop G2, C takes D4, Knight takes D4, Knight C6, H3, Queen B4, Bishop E3, Queen takes C4, short castle, short castle, Rook C1, Queen A6, G4, Queen A5, Queen D3, E6, Knight B3, Queen D8, Bishop C5, Rook E8, Bishop D6, B6, Knight D4, Knight D5, Knight takes D5, E takes D5, Knight takes C6, D takes C6, Rook takes C6, Bishop takes B2, Bishop takes D5, Bishop E6, E4, Rook C8, Rook takes C8, Queen takes C8, Rook D1, Queen D7, Bishop G3, Bishop G7, King G2, Bishop F8, Queen F3, Queen A4, Rook D2, A5, Rook D3, Bishop E7, Bishop E5, Bishop takes D5, E takes D5, Bishop D8, Bishop F6, Queen takes A2, D6, Queen C4, D7, Rook F8, Bishop takes D8, Rook takes D8, Queen F6, Queen E4, check, King G1, Queen A8, Queen E7, King G7, Rook D6, A4, Rook takes B6, A3,